All right, so we're talking about how do we correlate the history of the Old Testament with the other history around us. So one of those things is the history of Egypt. There's a long, long history in Egypt, and we talked about the Merneptah stele. This is where people go for the late date. But as you move past that, past the time of the Exodus, you then enter the time of the Judges and the United Kingdom. And so basically the idea here is if you're trying to set up a chronology of the Old Testament, where you put the Exodus is going to affect or influence or determine really where you put the other events, right? So we see a duck flying by. Yeah. So if you put the Exodus at the early date, 1447, then you would go 40 years of wandering. Most people accept that. I don't know why they accept those years and they don't accept the other years. But anyway, most people seem to, or maybe some people take it more literally than others. But if you do leave in the 40 years, then you have 1407 or 1406. This would be the time of the conquest. Okay, so now if you take the later date, then they would say the Exodus takes place around 1270, which means that the conquest in Judges takes place around 1230. Then that gives you a few years to get kind of established before you have to deal with the Merneptah stele, which is at 1220, you see? So if you start at 1270, and really that's how they determine where they set the Exodus. Kind of set the clock back the other way. Say, okay, if there are people known as Israel that are mentioned on this stele at 1220, and the Egyptians are engaging them in battle, and of course, according to the Egyptians, defeating them, that means they had to be there at least for a little bit of time. So if we take the 40 years, 1270 to 1230, you give them 10 years to kind of get established, do the conquest and that sort of thing. And then the Egyptians come and beat them up, basically. Merneptah sends his people in. All right, so that's how you get the other date. Okay. So you can adjust your dates to that. But a date that nobody adjusts is the next one that I have up here, when the United Monarchy is. That's taking place a little before 1000. I've rounded the dates off just a little, but that's pretty much it. Saul, David, and Solomon are roughly are divided into these 40-year periods as kings. Saul first, then David, then Solomon. Okay, so David and Solomon is father and son. Saul, of course, is a king not related to David directly. So we don't have time to go into all those stories, but I assume you've heard some of this before somewhere, right? All right, so we see by the time you get to that, you've got the United Monarchy, and this is actually when you get to that King's passage that's for the early date, where you see the dedication of the temple there in 966 or 967, plus 480 years, because it says it pretty directly there in 1 Kings 6:1, 480 years from the Exodus to the dedication of the temple. So that's where the early date comes from. So the early date comes from this passage in Kings. The late date comes from the date of the inscription of the Merneptah stele. Okay? So the early pharaoh would be Thutmose III. The late date would be Ramses II. And of course, as we've said a couple of times, that is Hollywood's favorite pharaoh. He shows up in the movies there. All right. So by the time we have this, we go from So really you're going to have, if you take the late date, you're going to have from about 1230 to about 1050 to have everything that's happening in the period of the conquest and the judges. So think about that. That would be, 100 years would be 1150, right? 50 more years, 150 years would be to 12. And then, about the 1220 would be another. So it'd be 170 years roughly between the time of the Exodus and the time of both the conquest and the judges. Now, if you go through and look at all the judges that are listed, and we're not going to do that here, but there are quite a few judges listed, and the sort of time frame that's given for them, even if you just gave them, like each sort of 15 years or something, that takes up more than that amount of time. So basically, people who hold to this later date say that there were contemporaneous judges. In other words, there were more than one judge at one time that are written about. Those judges, sometimes some of them were happening at the same time. That's the only way you can make it fit, sort of chronologically. Of course, Solomon also is involved with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians become his somewhat de facto navy, because he doesn't really have a navy. He does have a lot of territory. And also, I just have it up here briefly, but the alphabet really comes from the Phoenicians. So Hebrew is, as opposed to, say, the Egyptian stuff that's in hieroglyphics, Hebrew writing and Akkadian and so forth is in alphabetic writing. So hieroglyphics is pictographic, while these other languages are using an alphabet. Okay. Of course, the earlier Mesopotamian writing is in cuneiform, which is not alphabetic. Well, let's move on. So here is the map. We may have showed you this one before, but this kind of conflates everything together. It's showing you a potential route of the Exodus. And of course, Taylor's not going to like that route. That route is, he may not care. But anyway, that route is not sort of the conventional route of it. And then you see them going to Mount Sinai, right? So they come from Egypt. They cross the Red Sea, or the Yam Suf, and then they make their way into the Sinai Peninsula. And at the base of the Sinai Peninsula is Mount Sinai. Now, this again is a traditional site. There's a long history connecting it with Mount Sinai. Is it actually Mount Sinai? Well, when I've taken students, I've taken groups especially when I take them to Israel and Jordan and stuff, and they want to identify, is this where this happened? And I say, sometimes I tell them it's the 1 mile rule. Within a mile of here it happened. That's, is that good enough for you? Yeah, I remember I had a whole group of students, and we were at the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem, right? And the guide pointed to a big olive tree, and he said, this tree is that Jesus prayed many times at this tree. And he had said a lot of things like that during the course of, 2 weeks, 10 days we were there. And so I would sometimes get the students later and say, we don't really know if that was exactly there, but And so they got to the point where he would say something like that, and then they would turn and look at me. So I still remember that. We were there at the garden, and they go, there's this great big old tree, and he goes, Jesus prayed many times at this tree. And then the students kind of go, went like, yeah. I said, well, within a mile of here, because it was on the Mount of Olives, and, it was an olive tree. Was it that particular tree? Well, that's a very old tree, but I don't think we can know for sure that was the tree, All right? So, anyway. Is this Mount Sinai? It is a mountain. You know, there's a lot of mountains down here. I think I told you I climbed up there once. And the monks have built a little chapel up at the top, and there is a path, and people go up there. Most people, since it's very hot down there, and you're going usually in the summer, most people, people climb up around midnight. That's how you get up to the top of Mount Sinai. Most people, if you want to, really want to climb all the way up, because it gets so hot. So you're climbing up this mountain in the dark. I didn't have a flashlight really, and I didn't have much with me, and neither did other people. So you're just kind of going in the moonlight, and you're climbing up this mountain. You're following the trail up, and then you get to the last part of it, and it's stairs that the monks have created in the stone. There's no handrails. There's no, I mean, you can just fall right off of there and roll down. So you got to be careful. And I don't know how many stairs there were, but there were a lot of stairs. Let's just say there was a lot. Let's say hundreds of stairs.
If
and
they built stairs, why didn't they build handrails?
Yeah, well, you'd think so. Those monks. Anyway, yeah, they sort of just took stones and put them there. I don't know if they maybe carved some of them. It was hard to tell in the dark, but there are stairs. And then you get up to the top, and then when you get up to the top, it's still dark. But then you notice here's where the other people are who've gone before you. They're all waiting. And what are they waiting for? The sunrise. You want to be there when the sun comes up. This is supposed to be the thing to do. I don't know who decided that, but and it is. I mean, it is pretty impressive. It is pretty neat. So you see the sun's rising up over the mountains of Mount Sinai while you're up on this high peak, and it is pretty spectacular. But there's also a guy up there selling refreshments, which I was very surprised. Guy was up there. He had like soft drinks, bottles of water, and some sandwiches. So I ate something because I was pretty hungry, and I drank something. And you go into a little chapel, and then you just kind of sit there with your fellow pilgrims, I guess you could call them. And I actually climbed up with a bunch of Mormons. That was very interesting. Because it was just me, and there was a bunch of Mormons, and so they talked freely amongst themselves because they didn't really know I was not one of them. So I heard a lot of Mormon stories that I'm sworn to not tell. So they enter the land, and then of course they come up around. This has them going this way. They may have gone the other way, but they bypass the Edomite territory, and they come into the land of Moab. And it's right about where that red arrow is there, that Moses he's been told by God that he will not enter the promised land, but I will allow you to see it. So it's high up there, and he can look down, and he can see Jericho, and he can even see the hills of Jerusalem and so forth, the Jordan River and all those things, and the Dead Sea. And because it's high up, you can see it. It's about 1,400 feet above sea level, and the Dead Sea is about 1,400 feet below sea level. So 2,500 feet difference in elevation. And it says that Moses was not allowed to enter because of his sin, that he had produced the water from the rock, and he took credit for it. He did it. So God said, well, you don't get the privilege of entering the land. And it says no one knows where he's buried. And there is no marker, there is no grave, as they say, as Moses. From there, then they enter the land, they cross over, their Jericho's right about there, and then they have the conquest in this area. All right. What ends up happening then is Solomon, of course, is a very tough king. We always think of him as somebody who's very wise. I don't know what you think about. You think of Solomon. Maybe you think of somebody who's very, has a lot of wives and concubines. That's also true. He does have a lot of wives. I always wondered about that. If he's so wise, why does he have so many wives and concubines? I just don't know if that's wise. It doesn't seem to me to be wise, but...
Practice to take a wife from a country you made an ally with?
Well, that was part of it. Yes, he would make an alliance that way, but I don't think there were 1,000 of them out there. You know what I'm saying? 1,000 countries.
He really liked, he took more than one.
Well, yeah. Anyway, he had a lot of wives and a lot of concubines, okay? So let's just leave it at that. Yes, part of them were marriages, I suppose, of alliance, agreement, or whatever you want to call that. But still, that's a lot of ladies. That's all I'm saying. I just really can't, you know. That seems to me like that would just really be really, really tough. I mean, that's like not wise. It does not seem wise to me at all. Because I think these ladies are going to fight with one another, right? And they're going to fight with you. And they're, with Solomon. And they're going to like cause a lot of trouble. So why? Well, anyway. So what happens is even though he was a tough ruler, because you know what he did? Solomon forced people to work. It's called corvée. That's a French word that those French guys like to say. Corvée. Corvée work is forced labor. So this is how Solomon got a lot of stuff built that he got built, including the temple and the Temple Mount and all that kind of stuff. It took a lot of labor. And so basically he told the people they were required to work for him. So you might call it temporary slavery or whatever. Slavery might be too tough of a word, but it is a part of what you had to pay, sort of pay like in your tax, is to come and do this work. So this is how Solomon got so many things built. So he was tough on the people. Many people thought Solomon had been very tough to them, taxed them a lot, forced them to do this labor, and so forth. And then Solomon dies, right? So now his son, anybody remember his son's name? No? Didn't know there was going to be a Bible quiz. That's it. The other one. Rehoboam, yes. Rehoboam is his son. Jeroboam is the guy that writes. So Rehoboam, basically the advisors of Solomon tell Rehoboam, look, Rehoboam, your father was tough on the people, and what we advise you is you lighten it up some. You lighten it up because it's just been too much tax, too much stuff. Rehoboam does not accept that. I don't want to spoil the story for you, but he does not accept it. And in fact, I think in the King James is where I get this. I don't know, it just comes to my mind because, when I was a kid, I always read the King James, because that was the Bible. I mean, what else was there? But he says something like this, and this image always stuck in my mind, and I think I've got it right, but you can check me on it. He said, sort of like, if you think my father was tough, my little finger will be thicker or as thick as my father's thigh. In other words, I'm going to come down on him. How many times thicker is your thigh than your little finger? I don't know. A lot, right? 100 times? I don't know. I guess it depends on how big your thigh is and how big your little finger is. But, for me, it's a lot, right? I don't know about you. So it's going to be 100 times. I'm going to be 100 times tougher on him, even though these advisors don't do it. His peers, his buddies said, oh yeah, just let him have it. And so he does. Now this causes then a uprising, a rebellion. This is encouraged by the Egyptians, by the way. The Egyptians are the ones who are looking to, kind of get back in control, sort of rule us down, because this is the most powerful period, to be honest, the most powerful period of Israelite history is under the reign of Solomon. It's unified all the way up from Lebanon, all the way down to the Red Sea, all the way out to the Mediterranean, and all the way over, maybe into Syria, right? And he's got a lot of alliances all the way down into Arabia. So he is controlling and allied with a lot of territory into Mesopotamia, into Arabia, and so forth. And Egypt, of course, doesn't like it. Egypt is much weaker by this point. But they encourage this rebellion. And so that's the other guy, Jeroboam. Jeroboam is the rebel. Jeroboam is sponsored or, whatever, by the Egyptians. And they come in. So this ends up being then there will be a division. There will end up being two kingdoms instead of one. So the united monarchy, the united kingdom versus the divided kingdom or divided monarchy. I still remember, I used to live in Kentucky. That's a place, a land far away in the north. And they've got a school up there. I don't know if you've heard about it. They call it UK, the University of Kentucky. And so I remember another professor there at the school. It was a much smaller school than this, and we had a mail room. We had a place where you could take your stuff, and they would put postage on it. So he took his letter. He took this letter to the mail room area, and he told the student working there. He said, "Now, here's my letter. It needs postage." And he said, "No, that's going to need extra postage because it's going to the UK." And the student said, "Well, no, that won't need extra postage. That's only over in Lexington." So there you go, the UK. Sometimes on tests and terms, when I would put the United Kingdom, meaning this United Kingdom, they would tell me about England and Scotland and stuff. So I say, always look at the chapter. Are we talking about England now? No. So probably that's not the right answer. Anyway, so it divides into two kingdoms, the north and south, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom takes the name Israel. Israel. Associated with it, there are 12 tribes. 10 of the 12 tribes are associated with the northern kingdom of Israel. The capital is no longer at Jerusalem, it's at Samaria. The capital's at Samaria, right? According to the prophets, and this is also the point where the Bible, there's lots of prophets, and we're not going to go through all those prophets, but the one thing you need to do if you're going to take a look at the prophets, which I think you should, I'll just say that. I'll be bold and say that. There are 12 minor prophets and 5 major prophets. So the minor prophets doesn't mean they are lesser of importance. It just means they're shorter books. There's 5 bigger books, longer books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth. And there are 12 shorter ones, like Obadiah and things like that, okay? So, but one of the things you need to identify with those prophets is, are they particularly concerned with the north or the south? That's the first thing you should really think about. Geographically, who's their audience? Who's their primary audience? So anyway, in the north, what they are often accused of by the prophets and so forth is of apostasy, of worshiping false gods, other gods, Baal and Asherah and so forth, right? So now what happens is there is an alliance to the north up here in Syria and off to Damascus and on of the Arameans. Their people are called the Arameans. All of these areas are basically under the thumb of the Assyrians. The Assyrians control directly and or indirectly these territories of Mesopotamia, including Syria and really including Israel, Palestine, this whole area. The Assyrians control it. Because once Solomon goes and once everything begins to fall apart, the Assyrians come in and basically say, you know what you're going to have to do? You're going to have to give us money every year. They call it tribute money sometimes, tribute money. So you're going to have to come and bring us goods, items, and money every year. And if you do that, then, we won't attack you. We won't come down and kill you or attack you or destroy things. So it's better off for you. Okay, we call it kind of like protection money. You pay me, I leave you alone. You don't pay me, well, it's not going to be good for you. I want to come down here and do it. So this is what happened. And some of these areas, like the Arameans and those of Israel and so forth, they decide that, you know, they're in between Assyrian monarchs, and they decide, you know what? This is our time. We can become independent now. We can get rid of the Assyrian control. So it takes a few years for the Assyrian ruler to get his house in order, and then he comes after them. And there's a huge battle, the Battle of Karkar, which is up there, and chariots and horses, and you know, and so you can read all about it. I mean, it's in the Old Testament, as well as you can find other sources for this battle. And basically, again, I hate to spoil the story for you. The Assyrians win. Okay, as you might have figured they would, because they had just a ruthless and large army. All right, so the Assyrians are the bad guys, and for good reason. They would decapitate people. They would impale people. Impaling, you know, they would take a wooden stake, a wooden pole, they'd sharpen it at the end, and they would take a person and jam them down on top of that, underneath their rib cage. Yeah. And they would just leave them there. You know, what are you going to do? And they would leave them there, and they would die slowly and painfully, and, you know, birds and stuff would come and visit them and not do nice things and so forth. So it was terrible stuff. And they would go around and cut the heads off of their enemies, and they would stack them up in little pyramid shapes, you know, to be a message. It was a message to anyone. If you resist the Assyrians, this is what's going to happen to you. We're going to impale you. We're going to chop your heads off. The other thing that they would do, they would flay people. F-L-A-Y, flay. To flay means to skin. Well, you know, my mother said this to me maybe once or twice. I'm sure she was probably just joking. Well, my mother said something like this to me. I don't know if you've ever had a relative say something like this to you. Probably not, because you come from very civilized backgrounds. But I didn't. And my mother would say to me sometimes, "I'm going to skin you alive." Have you ever heard anybody say that to you? "I'm going to skin you alive." Really, Mom? That's what you wanted? No. But, you know, she would say that in anger. I don't think she was really serious. Well, anyway, she never did it. And but the Assyrians did. The Assyrians did. In fact, they even depict it in their artwork, if you want to call it artwork. It's depicted for you. They would stake people out face down with their arms out like this, you know, and their legs out and their face down. And then they have them tied down, staked down, and they would cut across the top of their shoulders, and they would rip it off their backs all the way down the tops of their legs and leave them there. And the insects and the ants and the sun and whatever. So these are the Assyrians. By the way, there's a guy named Jonah. He's one of these prophets. You may have heard of him, Jonah. And a big sea creature, right? Jonah, if you really read the story and you understand the Assyrians, God says to Jonah, "Jonah, go to Nineveh and preach to them." And what does Jonah say? Well, he says, "No, I'm not going there." Actually, he says, "God, I knew you were going to do that." You know, that's when he actually goes there and preaches. Then he gives them salvation. God, you're giving the Assyrians salvation? I never passed this thing around. Let me give you that. You're giving the Assyrians salvation. I knew you would do that. So why did Jonah flee? Well, maybe he was afraid. I wouldn't blame him. But also, he just didn't want them to have salvation. I think that's pretty clear. And God orders him to go, and so finally he persuades him to go, and Jonah goes and preaches, and look, all these people are saved. And Jonah is not happy. He's not like, oh man, I preached, and look at all these hundreds of people that come to salvation. This was so successful, I'm so happy. No, he is sad. He is upset. Why? Because the Assyrians were like the worst people. They skinned people alive. They impaled people. Well, so eventually the northern kingdom is defeated. And what the Assyrians' practice was is they would take the leaders from one area and haul them away to another area, and they'd bring the leaders from another area and bring them into that area. This to keep people from rebelling. So you find all the people are potentially sort of the leaders, and we haul them away, and we bring in leaders from somewhere else. When that happened, these are sometimes called the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they basically kind of disappear. You don't hear any more about it. And people have thought up all kinds of stuff about the 10 lost tribes, and we don't have time to go through it, but they've said that they became England, and they've said that they became the Mormons. They've all kinds of stories about the 10 lost tribes. So that's where that comes from. Probably what really happened there is that with the leaders gone and their tendency to worship false gods, is they just began to worship other gods and intermarried, and they never returned, and therefore the northern kingdom is gone, and we have the 10 lost tribes. Well, we're out of time, I think, so we better end there.